David Alexander at the University College London was nice enough to publish this etymological origins of the word resilience. You can see how into these words I am. He says that it starts way back in AD 35, and it's this concept that exists in law, and then he traces it through lots of different disciplines. Sure enough, here's engineering, and we saw that on the Ngram analysis. Well, here it is in the social sciences. We refer to the resilience. You hear this word grit a lot now. Children who are at risk, but they persist anyway. So there's the resilience at the scale of the individual. It certainly shows up in business, your supply chain resilience. Can you maintain your manufacturing operations even under a power outage or the loss of a key supplier? It shows up in the natural sciences and is largely attributed to hauling. And then there's this new area, this disaster risk reduction, this emerging area in which we're applying it to infrastructure systems. That doesn't tell us what resilience is, because resilience is all over the place. And unfortunately, right now, if someone in child psychology learns something really cool about resilience, it doesn't inform supply chain management or disaster risk reduction at all, because resilience is used in these different contexts in people who are out of communication with one another. In our context, in this disaster response, resilient infrastructure context, I've seen at least 3 different ways that resilience is characterized. So I'm going back to a paper that we published in 2007. This is on oil spill response. And it shows in these 2 dimensions, kind of the crisis life cycle. There is an event. The event causes some degradation in the environment or an infrastructure. We respond to the event. We want to recover. This is an important part of the way resilience is understood in the federal government. And we either want to get to a better state or we want to restore to the previous state that we had. On the vertical axis, it shows that these activities do not happen in a vacuum. If we only look at recovery and restoration, if we look at these outcomes, it's too late. We need to know what the processes are, what the resources are available before the incident so we can plan for it, and whether we're going on the right track even before we can measure the outcomes. So there are these 3 different ways that resilience is characterized. Resilience is either a thing. Resilience is your backup generator. Resilience is your spare fuel supply. Resilience is the canned goods that you keep in the basement or the bottled water that you've stored up for, I don't know, the tornado. Resilience might, however, be your actions, the way you respond or adapt or communicate or innovate under stress. The September 2014 floods in Phoenix that I showed you, turns out people in Phoenix have a lot of boats. The highest boat registration per capita in the United States is in the state of Arizona. This makes no sense to me because you can't, jet ski through the desert, except on September 9th. The streets were so flooded that people got on their jet skis, and that's how they got around and checked on their neighbors. That's an adaptive response to changing circumstances. So sometimes resilience is in your actions, and sometimes resilience is in your outcomes. How long were you down? How long did it take you to come back up, to restore or to recover from the stress? All 3 ways of thinking about resilience are correct because we need this pluralistic understanding of a multidisciplinary concept. So resilience is at least 3 things, but there are 2 things that get a lot of attention: the stuff, the nouns, and the outcomes. Where we aren't paying enough attention as scholars is in these practices. That's because the verbs are really hard to measure. They're really hard to study. Here we have innovation and adaptation. And so what I'm suggesting is that's where we need to focus more research attention. This is the Mississippi River in 1927. And the 1927 floods changed the profession of civil engineering. They changed the role of the federal government in managing infrastructure. They changed the way we think about ourselves today, all of which has been chronicled in this wonderful historical engineering book called Rising Tide. These floods were so bad and so catastrophic that they empowered the Army Corps of Engineers to channelize the Mississippi River, to build levees and dikes and bypasses and concrete walls and ensure that such a disaster would never happen again as a result of billions of dollars of investment, at least until 1993. This is what we got for our efforts to channelize and control the Mississippi River. The exact same flooding or worse. All this investment and all this expertise amounting to the same terrible outcome. But this is what the river looked like in 2011. 2011, we were talking record in-stream flows. There's more water in the Mississippi River than there was in 1993 or there was in 1927. So where's the damage? Where's the terrible floods? What was the difference between the 1993 disaster and the 2011 non-disaster? And the difference is the New Madrid floodway. In response to the 1927 floods, Congress created something called the New Madrid floodway in eastern Missouri. It's an easement that runs through sparsely populated farmland. And it says to the people who own that land, we as the federal government have the right to inundate your land. We can flood you out at our discretion. They foresaw in 1927 the possibility of another flood and the possibility that their protection measures would fail. And they're like, you know what, we gotta, where's the water gonna go? We're gonna give a place for the water to go. And so they created this easement so that they can intentionally flood it out. And from 1927 on, it was never activated. It was not activated in 1993. Instead, they flooded out other areas. Not intentionally, by the way. But in 2011, the Army Corps of Engineers said, this is the moment that the New Madrid floodway was created for. We must flood out we must use our easement and give the water a place to go so that we can spare more densely populated, more highly built up areas. And keep in mind that this is the Army. How do they activate the floodway? They blow it up. They blow up the levee that prevents water from entering the floodway. They do that in the north, which is upstream. And then they got to blow it up a little bit later, 2 places downstream to let the water back out of the floodway into the Mississippi River. So I'm going to argue that blowing up your own infrastructure is an adaptive, innovative response. So we want to understand what are the generalizable aspects of what's going on in these processes. What are the processes that make a system or an organization resilient? And I submit to you that there are at least 4. Anticipation, adaptation, learning, and sensing. And I'm not sure what order they come in. They might be all happening at once. Sometimes they come in sequence. But I'm going to take you around this loop, and we're going to examine what these processes are. Sensing. We need to know the state of the system. In this case, in the Mississippi River case, that would mean how much snowpack is there? How hard is it raining? What's the in-stream flow? So we need gauges. We need radar. We need snow measurements. We need weather forecasts. This is all a way of sensing our current state and our near-term state. That helps us anticipate. And here I'm drawing a distinction between probability and possibility. Probability might say, well, there's a 20% chance of rain. Possibility says we could get hail. I don't know what the chance is anymore. We're just examining the possibility space by anticipating what could happen, not what will or what's likely to happen. And the reason we need to stay in this anticipation rather than forecasting is our minds conflate improbable with impossible. There are those situations where we say, well, it's 99% likely, and we go, well, it's definitely going to happen, except for the 1% when it doesn't. So we need to stay aware of the possibilities so that we're not surprised. Terrific. We've sensed, we've anticipated, for example, when is the river going to crest? How high could it go? Now we adapt. And adapt is our actions in response to what's going on in our imagination. We change the way we're structured. We change the way we behave. We leave work early. We cancel our Friday meeting. We declare a snow day at Northeastern. We say the kids are off from school. We blow up the levees. That's the adaptive response. And if we're fortunate, we learn. I've given you several examples where we clearly weren't learning. Washington, D.C. seems to have learned nothing from the experience that Atlanta had. And this is all too frequent, where the knowledge is local. The salient emotional experience, by that I mean the pain of living through the traffic jam or having your kids stay overnight at school unexpectedly, whatever it isn't transferred from one city's experience to another. And so if Atlanta has learned something, All too often, Washington, D.C. learns nothing. But these are the 4 processes that I submit to you, at least, there might be others, but at least are necessary for a resilient organization. So why aren't we resilient? This is a slide that I photographed that Steve Flynn put up. And he said there are 4 obstacles between us and resilience. We don't know. We don't know how poorly prepared we are. We fall into this fallacy of thinking that our past success is representative. It should frame our expectations of the future. Just because it worked in the past, and I tried to make this case very beginning of the presentation, does not mean that it's going to work in the future. So Steve says one of the barriers is we don't know how poorly prepared we are. He also says we don't know what resilience is or how to create it. Even if we know how bad off we are, we don't know what to do. He says even if we knew what to do, we don't have incentives to do it. As a matter of fact, there are counter incentives to making the kinds of investments that would make our infrastructure more resilient. And he goes, finally, even if we had the incentives, we don't have the governance structures in place to carry out, to act in response to those incentives. So these are the 4 barriers. And I love the way that Steve has laid it out, 1, 2, 3, 4. Because Steve has ordered these 4 obstacles in the same way that I teach ethics. The first thing you need to do is become aware of a problem. In the way I teach ethics, it's a moral problem or an ethical problem. Without awareness, there will be no response. After awareness, you need to develop judgment. And here, judgment means being able to formulate alternatives. You're not satisfied with the state of the world, that's a problem. You can imagine an improved state of the world. And engineers are very fortunate because we're the ones who get to imagine the world and then make the real world conform to our imagination. However, our imagination is represented in drawings or models. We get the prescriptive license of making the world a different place. Hopefully we have the judgment to imagine new alternatives and then rank order those alternatives as most to least preferred, one being better than the other. We also need to be motivated. This judgment is irrelevant if we're not motivated to do something about it, if we're not motivated to work towards a better future and we are not done yet. Motivation is insufficient because inevitably action will require us to get through this courage barrier. We are not going to act to make the world a better place out of fear of rejection or retribution or some personal risk that we accept upon ourselves. So we need to have courage before we can act. So Steve has laid out the 4 barriers that correspond exactly to this model of moral action and development that I teach in my ethics classes.